The unthinkable just became reality, and the shockwaves are tearing through 77 years of global security in ways most people haven't fully grasped yet. Right now, at this very moment, the President of the United States is openly threatening military force against Denmark, a NATO ally, a democracy, a nation that sent its sons and daughters to die alongside American troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. And when White House officials were pressed on camera about whether force could be ruled out, they didn't offer reassurances. They didn't walk it back. Instead, they said something far more chilling. Nobody would fight us over Greenland. As if the absence of resistance somehow legitimizes aggression. As if raw power alone now determines what's acceptable in international relations. Let that reality settle in your mind for just a moment, because we've crossed into completely uncharted territory. No NATO member has ever threatened another with military action in the alliance's entire history. Not during the Cold War, not during the Suez Crisis, not during internal disputes over Iraq or Libya. Never. The entire framework of Western security rested on one foundational promise: we protect each other, we don't threaten each other. That promise just shattered. 6 days ago, Denmark's Prime Minister issued a warning that no Allied leader has ever had to make. She said plainly that if the United States moves against another NATO country, everything stops. Not reforms, not renegotiations, everything. NATO collapses. The security architecture built on the ashes of World War II disintegrates overnight. And here's what makes her statement so profoundly alarming. She wasn't engaging in diplomatic theater. She was preparing. Denmark is actively planning right now for a scenario where America becomes an adversary instead of a protector. Think about the magnitude of that shift. Military planners in Copenhagen are wargaming American aggression. Defense ministers across Europe are holding emergency consultations about what happens if the United States can no longer be trusted. Alliance structures that seemed permanent just weeks ago are suddenly provisional, contingent, fragile. What changed everything? 1 week ago, the United States military entered Venezuela and seized its president, not in response to an attack, not with congressional authorization, not with international legal justification. American forces simply went in and took him. The operation bypassed every constitutional safeguard designed to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral military action. No debate, no vote, no notification to Congress until it was already done. And that single operation obliterated the last remaining argument that these threats are merely negotiating tactics or rhetorical bluster. Venezuela proved the administration will act without warning, without authorization, without restraint. Greenland demonstrates where they're looking next, and the pattern is unmistakable. Force has been normalized, precedent has been set, and the constraints that once existed have evaporated.
Let's be absolutely clear about what Greenland actually represents, because the official justifications collapse under even basic scrutiny. Greenland is a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, a relationship that predates American independence. About 57,000 people live there, mostly indigenous Greenlanders who have built a functioning society with universal healthcare, free higher education, and strong democratic institutions. Through Denmark, Greenland is part of NATO, which means threatening Greenland means threatening a NATO ally. But here's the part that exposes how baseless these threats actually are. The United States already has everything it claims to need. There's a major American military base on Greenland's northwest coast that's been operational since the 1950s. Early warning radar systems monitor Arctic approaches. Roughly 150 U.S. military personnel are stationed there right now under a defense agreement that grants America extensive rights with no expiration date. American ships, aircraft, and military vehicles move freely across Greenland. Denmark has consistently cooperated with every American defense requirement and has even offered to expand U.S. presence further if needed. So if America already has strategic access, radar coverage, treaty rights, and full cooperation from Denmark, why is the president insisting we need to own Greenland? The justifications don't hold up. The administration offers two main justifications, and both disintegrate when examined closely. First, they claim Russia or China might take over if America doesn't act. But that makes no sense whatsoever. Greenland is already protected as part of NATO. Any Russian or Chinese move against it would trigger Article 5, bringing the full force of the alliance to bear. The threat isn't real, it's manufactured. Second, they point to rare earth minerals. Greenland does have significant untapped reserves of materials used in everything from electric vehicles to advanced weapons systems. China currently dominates global rare earth processing, so the resource argument sounds plausible until you dig one layer deeper. Mining experts have testified that extracting those minerals would require decades of work and infrastructure investments that don't currently exist. Greenland's climate is brutally extreme, making extraction extraordinarily expensive. And critically, the United States has its own rare earth reserves that would be far simpler to develop than annexing territory from an ally. So if neither justification holds up, it leaves something far more unsettling. This may not be about strategy at all. The president proposed buying Greenland years ago. Denmark rejected it. The president canceled a state visit in apparent retaliation. Now, years later, the issue has returned, but this time it's escalated, militarized, and framed as inevitable.
Denmark isn't responding with diplomatic protests alone. They're responding with the largest military buildup in their modern history. Before this latest escalation even began, Copenhagen had already announced billions in new Arctic defense spending specifically focused on Greenland. But after the White House made clear that force remained on the table, that defensive posture shifted from precaution to urgency. Denmark is now acquiring new fighter jets, expanding Arctic patrols, building a new Arctic command headquarters, deploying maritime surveillance aircraft, installing early warning radar systems in eastern Greenland, and laying submarine cables to connect Greenland more directly to Danish infrastructure. Their defense spending is set to exceed 3% of GDP, far above NATO's standard target. Pause and absorb what that actually means. A NATO ally is arming itself because of threats coming from the United States. That sentence should be impossible to write, yet here we are. NATO was founded in 1949 on one simple, unshakable principle. An attack on one member is an attack on all. Article 5, the Mutual Defense Clause, has been invoked exactly once in the alliance's history, after September 11th. When America was attacked, allies responded without hesitation. Denmark responded. Danish soldiers fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. 50 of them died in those wars, fighting alongside Americans, honoring the alliance. And now the United States is threatening them with military force. The betrayal is staggering. The strategic realignment. European security experts are now openly discussing scenarios where the United States becomes an adversary rather than a guarantor of European security. Major think tanks are advising governments to develop contingency plans that don't rely on American protection. France has publicly discussed extending its nuclear deterrent to other European nations. The European Union is accelerating defense integration programs. Countries are reconsidering weapons purchases from American manufacturers, concerned about future reliability. Canada has moved closer to Europe on defense coordination and has publicly stood with Denmark against American pressure. These aren't symbolic gestures or diplomatic posturing. These are fundamental strategic realignments, the kind that typically take decades to develop, now happening in weeks because trust has been shattered. Once that trust is gone, it doesn't simply snap back into place. The political response. Inside the United States, the political response has been revealing. Many Republican senators have publicly rejected the idea of using force against Greenland.
Some have used unusually blunt language, calling it foolish, dangerous, and counterproductive. That level of open opposition from within the president's own party almost never happens anymore, which tells you how alarming many lawmakers find this situation. But here's the critical distinction. Statements are not the same as action. While Republicans criticize the idea in interviews and press releases, the administration keeps escalating. Press secretaries repeat that all options remain on the table. Cabinet officials refuse to rule out force. The president himself says deals can be made the easy way or the hard way. And that gap between words and action is where the real danger lives. We've seen this pattern before during this administration. Strong statements of concern, expressions of alarm, then silence when it's time to actually vote or take concrete action that carries political cost. Venezuela followed that exact script. Senators said they were told nothing was planned, then days later the operation happened without congressional authorization. That's why a push is now underway in Congress to force an actual recorded vote. An amendment has been introduced to prohibit any funding for military action against Greenland. Under congressional rules, that amendment can't be quietly buried or procedurally avoided. It requires lawmakers to go on the record. Either you support preventing force against an ally, or you don't. There's no rhetorical middle ground. The people actually affected. Meanwhile, one group has been almost entirely absent from this entire conversation, and their absence is striking. The people who actually live in Greenland have made their position crystal clear. Public polling shows overwhelming opposition to joining the United States. The vast majority don't want it. Nearly half view the president's interest as a direct threat to their autonomy and way of life. Greenland's parliament has accelerated its legislative session specifically to address this crisis. Political party leaders across the entire spectrum have issued joint statements declaring that the future of Greenland belongs to Greenlanders, not to Washington, not to Denmark, to the people who live there. They want self-determination on their own terms, not absorption, not coercion, not to be treated as a commodity that can be bought or taken. Yet despite this clear, unambiguous rejection, the administration has appointed a special envoy whose explicit stated goal is to make Greenland part of the United States. Danish officials have called the appointment unacceptable, and the envoy has dismissed all concerns by claiming the United States has never engaged in imperialism, a statement so historically inaccurate it defies basic knowledge of American history, from the Philippines to Hawaii to Puerto Rico.
What this actually means. This isn't just about one island anymore. It's about what happens when the United States crosses lines it spent 75 years telling the rest of the world were sacred and inviolable. If America uses force against a NATO ally, the alliance doesn't bend or adapt, it breaks completely. The promise of mutual defense becomes meaningless overnight. Why would any European country trust the United States to protect them from Russia if America itself is willing to threaten them? And this fits into a broader pattern that's emerging with terrifying clarity. Venezuela first, seized without authorization, then Greenland, threatened with force, public discussion about reclaiming the Panama Canal, economic threats against Canada and Mexico framed as national security imperatives, talk of military operations against drug cartels that could spill across borders without host country consent. Analysts who track global security risks have warned that this presidency now operates with fewer institutional restraints than ever before. A cabinet filled with loyalists, a Congress that has repeatedly failed to assert its constitutional authority, a weakened bureaucracy that can't effectively push back. The guardrails are failing when they're needed most. The constitutional crisis. That brings us to the constitutional heart of this crisis, the part that should alarm every American, regardless of how they feel about any particular policy. The Constitution explicitly gives Congress the power to authorize war. The War Powers Resolution requires presidents to notify Congress and limits unilateral military action. Those rules exist precisely to prevent this kind of scenario.
one person deciding to use force based on personal judgment alone, without debate, without accountability, without the checks and balances the founders built into the system deliberately. In Venezuela, those safeguards were ignored completely. No authorization, no advance notice, just action. If that can happen there, it can happen anywhere, including Greenland. If Congress allows that precedent to stand, if it fails to act now when the threat is against a NATO partner, then the system of checks and balances effectively collapses in all matters involving the use of force. The president becomes unconstrained, able to order military action anywhere against anyone, based solely on personal discretion. That's not how the system was designed to work, and it's not how it can work if democracy and constitutional government are to survive. The moment of truth. Denmark has done everything within its power. It has invested billions in defense, warned publicly about consequences, rallied European allies to its side, appealed to international law and alliance obligations. But ultimately, Denmark cannot stop the United States on its own. No country can. Only Congress has the power and authority to impose limits, and the critical question is whether it will use that power or whether it will continue the pattern of concerned statements followed by inaction. The United States built the post-war international order. It created NATO. It championed principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the rule of law. It told the world for decades that might doesn't make right, that borders matter, that force cannot be the answer to every dispute. Now those principles are being tested from within by the very nation that established them. 50 Danish soldiers died fighting alongside Americans. Denmark stood with the United States when it mattered most, and now the United States is threatening them with military action? That reality is impossible to square with any coherent vision of leadership or stability. What makes this crisis so explosively dangerous is precisely how ordinary it's being treated. The language has shifted just enough to make something unprecedented sound manageable. Options, leverage, deals, as if threatening an ally with military force is just another bargaining chip in routine negotiations. But this isn't a negotiation tactic you can cleanly walk back from. Even if no action is ultimately taken, the damage is already spreading and deepening. Allies are recalculating their relationships with America. Institutions are adjusting their assumptions. Commitments that held firm for generations are being quietly rewritten or abandoned. For 50 years, the United States asked other countries to trust its leadership, to believe that American power came with restraint and responsibility, that its alliances were real and enduring, that when America spoke about rules and norms, it actually meant them. That trust didn't come from speeches or declarations. It came from consistency, from showing up, from honoring commitments even when it was costly or inconvenient. Now that consistency is in question, and once lost, it may be impossible to rebuild. If Congress fails to act, if it allows this to drift from rhetoric into precedent, the lesson learned globally will be devastatingly simple. There are no internal limits left in the American system. Decisions of war and peace can hinge on impulse. Treaties and alliances matter only until they don't. That's not just a foreign policy catastrophe, it's a constitutional crisis. Because the founders didn't design a system where one person could make these decisions alone. They built friction on purpose, debate and delay and votes and accountability, all of it meant to slow down exactly this kind of dangerous escalation. Those safeguards are being tested right now in real time. Denmark has made its position clear. Europe has responded. Greenlanders have spoken. The only unanswered question is domestic, whether the people entrusted with oversight will actually use it, or whether they'll continue the pattern of concern without action. This isn't really about Greenland at all. It's about whether there are still limits on American power and whether anyone is willing to enforce them when it counts.